In the summer of 1941, a 23-year-old woman named Rose Heilbronn was called to the bar as a barrister in England. In a factory in Coventry that same summer, a woman named Dorothy, who had been a seamstress before the war, was operating a lathe, cutting metal components for Spitfire engines to tolerances of 1/1000th of an inch, a precision she had not known was possible with human hands when she started 6 months earlier, and that she now produced routinely, shift after shift, without thinking about it. In a field outside Cairo, a woman named Mary Churchill, the Prime Minister's youngest daughter, was commanding an anti-aircraft battery, and the women under her command were tracking German aircraft across the Egyptian sky and feeding targeting data to the guns with a speed and an accuracy that their male commanding officers had. When the experiment was first proposed, doubted was achievable. 3 women, 3 countries, 3 occupations that did not exist for women before the war began. And behind them, in their millions, across every country touched by the conflict, a transformation of what women did, where they did it, who gave them orders, and what they discovered about themselves in the process. A transformation so total and so rapid that the world it produced by 1945 could not be fully returned to the world it had replaced. The role of women in the Second World War is a subject that has been described in the decades since in 2 contradictory ways. The first is the triumphant narrative, the story of women who proved, under the pressure of necessity, that they were capable of everything the war required of them, who entered factories and farms and hospitals and intelligence services and emerged 5 years later as something different from what they had entered as. The second is the corrective, the observation that most of what women gained during the war was taken back afterward, that the factories that had recruited women with unprecedented urgency dismissed them with equal urgency when the men came home, that the question of whether the war changed the fundamental position of women in society is more complicated than the triumphant narrative suggests. Both of these accounts are true. What tends to get lost between them is the daily reality of what it actually meant to be a woman in the war, the specific weight of the work, the specific texture of the experience, the specific discoveries that women made about their own capacities in a context that had not previously offered them the opportunity to make those discoveries, and which would not, for many of them, offer the opportunity again. In this video, we will reconstruct what the role of women in the Second World War actually looked like across the factories and the land armies and the auxiliary military services and the resistance networks and the concentration of domestic labor that made every other form of female war work possible, not as a story of what the war proved about women, but as a story of what women did in specific and demanding circumstances 80 years ago. The mobilization of women into the wartime workforce was not, in any of the major belligerent nations, a decision that was taken enthusiastically or without resistance. It was a decision that was taken because the arithmetic of total war made it unavoidable. Britain conscripted men from the age of 18 in 1939. By 1941, the demands of the military, the armaments factories, the civil defense services, the merchant navy, and the agricultural sector had created a labor shortage that could not be filled from the male population alone, because the male population available for civilian work was shrinking in exact proportion to the military's expanding requirements. In December 1941, Britain became the first country in the conflict to introduce conscription for women, unmarried. Women between the ages of 20 and 30 could be directed into the auxiliary military services, the munitions factories, or the land army. It was not a popular measure. It was a necessary one. The factory was where the largest number of women encountered the war as workers. And the factory was where the gap between what women had been told they were capable of and what the war proved they were capable of was widest and most immediately visible. The armaments factories of Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and Germany drew millions of women into work that had been, before the war, entirely male work with heavy machinery, work requiring precise technical training, work in environments that were hot and loud and physically demanding in ways that the domestic and service occupations from which most of these women had come had not been. The women who entered those factories were not, for the most part, women who had been waiting for the opportunity. They were women who had been told by the same society that was now urgently requiring their labor, that this kind of work was not what they did. The speed with which they learned it and the quality with which they performed it once they had learned was the most visible refutation of that telling that the war produced. The specific physical demands of factory work in the early 1940s were not trivial, and they were not modified for the women who entered the factories, because the war did not offer the luxury of modification. A woman operating a shell-filling line was handling explosive materials in quantities and at a pace that the production schedule dictated, and that physical discomfort did not adjust. A woman working in a steel foundry was working in temperatures that the foundry's requirements produced, and that her preference for a cooler environment did not reduce. A woman on a 12-hour night shift in an aircraft components factory was working a 12-hour night shift, and the children she had left with a neighbor or a mother-in-law or an elder sibling were at home being cared for by whoever she had found to care for them. And the question of what happened if the arrangement fell through was a question she carried through every hour of the shift, alongside the question of whether the component she was producing was within specification. The war did not simplify women's lives by giving them new work. It added the new work to the existing work and asked them to manage both. In the Soviet Union, the mobilization of women went further than in any other country in the conflict, in ways that still mark the Soviet experience of the war as distinct from every other. Soviet women served in combat roles, as snipers, as pilots, as tank crew, as infantry in numbers, and in a formalization of that service that no other major belligerent matched. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment, composed entirely of women, flew more than 20,000 combat missions over the course of the war in obsolete biplane aircraft that had no parachutes and no radar, navigating by stopwatch and map, dropping bombs on German positions at night from altitudes so low that the German soldiers who heard them coming could hear the wind in the aircraft's fabric wings. The Germans called them the Night Witches. The Soviet women who flew them called themselves, in the way that people who do dangerous things regularly develop a relationship with a danger that is neither bravado nor indifference, but something more specific and more earned. Simply pilots. There were 800,000 Soviet women in uniform by the end of the war. Roughly 100,000 of them were decorated for combat service. 89 received the Soviet Union's highest military honor. The Women's Land Army in Britain occupied a position in the war economy that was less visible than the factory worker and less dramatic than the Soviet combat pilot, and which was, in the specific terms of keeping the civilian population fed through 6 years of war, as important as either. By 1943, the Land Army had 80,000 members. Women from cities who had never held a pitchfork, who had never driven a tractor, who had never understood from the inside what the word harvest meant as a physical experience rather than a seasonal concept. They were billeted with farming families across rural Britain in conditions that ranged from comfortable to extremely difficult, depending on the farmer and the region. And they were required to do work that the farming calendar dictated without reference to their previous experience of it. They dug potatoes in October rain. They threshed wheat in August heat. They milked cows at 5 in the morning in February darkness. The farmers who received them had, in many cases, requested male labor and been sent female labor instead. And their initial skepticism was, in most recorded cases, revised by the end of the first harvest season, because the work that needed doing was done, and it was done by the women in front of them. And the evidence of that was the crop in the barn. The auxiliary military services, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the Women's Royal Naval Service in Britain, the Women's Army Corps in the United States. The equivalent formations in every other major military power created an entirely new category of female existence that had no real pre-war precedent. A woman in the WAAF in 1943 was living in barracks, taking orders from a chain of command, wearing a uniform, operating within a disciplinary structure, and performing work as a radar operator, as a plotter in a fighter control room, as a signals intelligence analyst, as a meteorologist, as a transport driver that was directly connected to the conduct of military operations in ways that the auxiliary designation obscured but did not change. The women who plotted the courses of German aircraft in the fighter control rooms of Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain were not auxiliaries in any meaningful operational sense. They were the people whose information determined where the Spitfires and Hurricanes went, and the outcome of the information they provided was measured in aircraft destroyed and pilots alive. Intelligence work drew women into the most concealed and, in terms of the specific skills it required, the most demanding roles of the war. The code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park in Britain, which produced the ultra-intelligence that Churchill described as his most precious secret, employed thousands of women who had been recruited from universities for their mathematical and linguistic abilities, and who were doing work whose existence they were prohibited from acknowledging for 30 years after the war ended. The women of Hut 6 and Hut 8 at Bletchley were operating the bomba machines that broke the German Enigma cipher, performing the mathematical work that the decryption process required, and producing intelligence assessments that were read at the highest levels of Allied command. They did this in conditions of complete secrecy, without recognition, and with the knowledge that the work they were doing could not be mentioned to anyone, including the families they went home to on leave. The discipline that required the particular discipline of doing work that matters enormously and being unable to say so was one of the distinctive demands of the war's intelligence apparatus, and it was a demand that fell as heavily on the women of Bletchley as on anyone else in the building. The Special Operations Executive sent women as agents into occupied Europe, into France, into the Netherlands, into Norway, into Yugoslavia, with the knowledge that capture meant torture and almost certainly death, because the Geneva Convention's protections for prisoners of war did not extend to agents operating in civilian clothes behind enemy lines. 39 women served as SOE agents in France alone. 13 of them were captured by the Gestapo. Most of those 13 died in concentration camps. Violette Sabo, Noor Inayat Khan, Odette Sansom. These were women who had been recruited, trained, and sent into occupied territory to organize resistance networks, to carry messages, to conduct sabotage operations, and to survive in an environment where the wrong face, seen on the wrong street at the wrong moment, was enough to end everything. The courage this required was not different in kind from the courage required of any combatant operating behind enemy lines. It was not recognized in the same way during the war, because the women performing it were not formally combatants. The men who sent them understood what they were sending them to. The women who went understood what they were going to. The formality of the designation did not alter the reality of the risk. In Germany, the mobilization of women into the workforce was complicated by an ideological contradiction that the Nazi regime never satisfactorily resolved. The official ideology of National Socialism placed the German woman in the home as wife, as mother, as the biological foundation of the racial project, and the regime had spent the 1930s discouraging female employment and rewarding marriage and childbirth with financial incentives and public honors. When the war's labor demands made female employment unavoidable, the regime attempted to recruit women voluntarily before resorting to the compulsion that would have contradicted its own propaganda, and the result was a mobilization that was slower, less complete, and less efficiently managed than the mobilizations of Britain and the Soviet Union. German women did enter the factories and the auxiliary services as the war continued, but they did so in a context where the state's ideological messaging and its practical requirements were pulling in opposite directions. And the women navigating that contradiction were doing so without the framework of explicit national necessity that made the British and American mobilizations legible to the women inside them. The domestic labor of women during the war, the cooking and the cleaning and the child rearing and the household management that continued regardless of what else women were doing, is the dimension of female war work that the histories most consistently undercount, because it was work that produced no statistics, no organizational records, no official narrative. A woman working a factory shift and then returning home to feed her children, clean the house, manage the ration books, write to her husband at the front, check the blackout, and get the children into the shelter. When the siren sounded, was doing two jobs simultaneously, neither of which acknowledged the existence of the other. The welfare infrastructure that might have supported her, the nurseries, the communal kitchens, the domestic support services, was improvised, inadequate, and unevenly distributed across the country. The women who managed both the new work and the existing work did so largely through the expansion of their own capacity, rather than through the provision of support by the state that was demanding the expansion. What the war gave women, alongside the work and the danger and the exhaustion, was a set of discoveries about themselves that the pre-war world had not offered the opportunity to make. A woman who had spent 6 months operating precision machinery discovered that she could operate precision machinery, a discovery that sounds obvious stated flatly, but that carried, for the individual woman making it, a weight that was anything but obvious, because she had been told by everything around her that this was not something she could do. A woman who had organized a resistance cell in occupied France discovered that she could organize a resistance cell in occupied France, and that the organizational skills, the judgment of character, the capacity for decisive action under pressure that the work required were things she possessed. A woman who had commanded an anti-aircraft battery discovered that she could command an anti-aircraft battery, and that command was something her mind and her temperament were suited to in ways that the peacetime world had given her no way to discover. The end of the war returned many of those women to positions that did not use what they had discovered. The factories that had recruited them with unprecedented urgency dismissed them with the same urgency when the men came home, because the men came home to a world that needed to believe, for its own coherence, that the war had been an interruption rather than a transformation. Many women accepted this. They wanted their husbands back. They wanted the war to be over. They wanted the return of ordinary life that the war had made impossible. But they carried what they had learned about themselves through the transition back to ordinary life. And ordinary life afterward was not quite the same as it would have been if the war had not happened, because the women inside it were not quite the same. That residue, the knowledge that stays in a person after the circumstances that produced it have passed, is the thing that the triumphant narrative and the corrective narrative, both in their different ways, miss. The war did not simply prove what women could do. It taught specific women in specific circumstances what they specifically could do. And that teaching did not end when the war ended. If this documentary gave you a richer understanding of what women contributed to and lived through in the Second World War 80 years ago, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, share this video with someone who would find it meaningful, and write in the comments which woman's story moved you most. Until the next video.